Welcome to Happy Path Programming. I'm Bruce Eckel.
I'm James Ward. Welcome everyone to Happy Path Programming. It's a beautiful summer day in Crested Butte. We've got the 4th of July fireworks tonight
On the 3rd
of July, and then
Just
the 4th of July parade tomorrow, which you and my daughter will be in, and I'll be maybe selling waffles out of the sunflower. Just
cool.
Summertime. It's wonderful.
Right. Yeah.
But today we have with us Johannes Schickling, who I was introduced to you from Michael Arenati, because you work with Michael on the Effect TypeScript stuff. And so welcome, Johannes. Great to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast, learned a lot on this podcast, and now excited to talk to you and maybe share some of my learnings.
Awesome. That's what we're here for, is to learn from the smart people.
Yeah, and the last time we talked about Effect was about a year ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so what's happened?
So this is what I want to start with, because this is going to be fun. So maybe a month ago, there was, I think around the TypeScript, the Effect TypeScript 3.0 release or something, there was a lot of attention from the typical kind of web JavaScript community around Effect. And I saw some of the like Hacker News and tweets and I don't know, influencer kind of things. And there were some people that were like, this is ridiculous. Why am I doing all this work? It seems like way overkill. And I think this highlights something that I want to ask you about, is like this community that you're targeting with Effect. They generally don't seem to be interested in some of the things that I'm interested in.
The computer sciencey stuff.
Give us your take on maybe let's start for those that didn't listen.
What percentage of the TypeScript community is your actual target audience?
Or JavaScript community? It's maybe there's some overlap there.
I think anybody who hasn't come to TypeScript is not going to be a target for an Effect.
Yeah,
I've got to believe there are people in the JavaScript community that want to write more reliable software. Maybe not. Maybe that's a bad assumption.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. So I think the interesting thing about the JavaScript and TypeScript community overall is that the barrier to entry is really low. So I think you have in that ecosystem, you have the most kind of self-taught bootcamp kind of developers who, like through their own side project, whatever, were curious enough to get their first website, their first web app up and running. They were able to deploy it. And that's amazing that you, without studying computer science, etc., you can be productive and creative enough to get real stuff out there. But that also now means you have a large amount of developers in the industry who've never really dealt with how to properly build production grade systems. And most of the people who build production grade systems are maybe using other program languages, or they're certainly not the majority in the JavaScript ecosystem. But by now, the JavaScript and TypeScript stack is so much the default for most software systems, certainly on the front end, but increasingly also on the back end, that now you need to build production grade systems with that language. And I think where we see the most interest and the most success with Effect is the intersection where people and companies build real production, or try to build real production grade systems with TypeScript. And turns out that is actually pretty tricky with TypeScript alone. This is where like all those things that are so nice in more modern programming languages like Rust and so on, where you had the benefit of hindsight of like how other programming languages have maybe made some mistakes that they could learn from in regards to error handling, observability, cancellation, all of those things. And to do those in TypeScript without an abstraction that feels like Zio, or that is what Effect is really tricky to build production grade systems. So where we have the most interest and the most success is for that intersection of TypeScript developers who want to or need to build production grade systems,
Hmm.
and they have experienced all the problems that a system like Effect is helping you to solve.
Right. So
However,
they
there's
have
a
enough experience to know, oh, you can't just throw things together. You will run into pain.
They have to
They have to know
they have
that.
to have experienced the
They have to
pain
experience the pain
of production
to be
grade.
motivated to go, okay, I do need to put effort into learning something more sophisticated.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this is where, I mean, the pool of TypeScript developers is so large that by now the absolute minority of people are already using Effect. I think by now a fairly sizable amount of developers have
Do
heard
you
about
have a
Effect,
sense of that?
but still,
Like
sorry.
what percentage? Do you have a
It's really
sense of the
hard to
percentage?
say.
Yeah.
I think one metric that we have to look at is sort of the npm download numbers, GitHub stars, Discord members. So I'm less interested in talking about absolute numbers right now. I
Sure.
think in npm downloads is like roughly 150,000 monthly downloads. But
Hmm.
what's more interesting is the trajectory and the sort of qualitative feedback that we're getting and the kind of companies that are
Hmm.
already using Effect. So there's like two notable companies that we're really excited about helping them being successful with Effect. Is like Vercel is moving more and more of their production workloads to Effect, and Vercel is like one of the key companies and sort of like tastemakers in the JavaScript and TypeScript ecosystem. Another one is Zendesk, which is polyglot in terms of their programming languages, but has a very decent amount of TypeScript and seems like they're standardizing more and more of their TypeScript code on top of Effect. And that's not a coincidence. Like they need to run production grade systems with TypeScript, and they have run into all the problems that Effect is solving, and now they can actually build those systems in a reliable way with Effect. And this is where also all the benefits in terms of the improved developer experience, etc., are paying off.
Yeah. And so it seems like there's this like spectrum of developers in this space where there's the people who are new to programming, they can tinker with JavaScript, they can have an LLM help them write JavaScript, they can get things working in the browser, that's exciting, they can get that thing working, on all sorts of different cloud providers. And it's so there's this like very easy path for new developers kind of into this world of building applications. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's the production grade, very mission critical systems, like you mentioned, Vercel and Zendesk. And somewhere along the people's journey in their journey of not just web applications, but JavaScript and TypeScript, they realize there's some things that I have been doing and have been challenging, some issues that have come up. How do I and code bases have scaled? How do I then use a framework or a library to help me deal with some of those common issues? And that's where Effect slots in. So I think what's challenging, what I saw in the Hacker News and tweets around this was there are some people who are like, oh my God, this is way too much. Like, why would I ever need that? And that just indicates maybe they're not on that kind of
Oh yeah,
production
what
grade side of
percentage of
the.
people actually get to the point where they go, oh, I see why we have these kinds of structures? I'm guessing less than 1%.
Percent of
Yeah.
that community.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
be
because I mean,
interesting to
so
try
many
to.
people are just hacking together websites.
Yeah.
I mean, the TypeScript ecosystem in terms of absolute numbers by now is just so huge that
Yeah,
it's certainly not the goal of the Effect project and Effect for the company to capture at some point the entirety of the TypeScript ecosystem. But the
sure.
goal is to help that percentage of the
Mhm,
TypeScript ecosystem who
of
need to
course.
build reliable production grade systems. And I think a good qualifier for those who eventually like get what Effect is all about is like they need to have experienced some of the pain, and like you've mentioned, and that is the best foundation for to be successful with Effect, since this is where you get to actually appreciate what are all of those things about. This is a lot of JavaScript developers are kind of like very naively on the presumed happy path, and they're kind of not really aware that stuff could go wrong. And I think that also shows in a lot of the web apps that we use on a daily basis, where error handling is not really something that's the default. But
Yeah.
turns out that stuff can go wrong a lot,
It
and
turns
the
out.
more sophisticated and the more the higher the aspirations are with your web app, the more you need to take care of that. And I think whoever has tried to make that happen and who has struggled, I think this is where you get to appreciate better error handling, things like interruption cancellations, structured concurrency, all the topics that you over the past couple of years have like deeply explored in this podcast, but in the TypeScript
So I
ecosystem.
guess part of my challenge with this though is that people that have chosen to use TypeScript, they've it's a whole nother level than just JavaScript. Like all of a sudden you have to have compilers, you have to have, you get a bunch of benefits, but there's a significant bar when you choose TypeScript, and you're getting all these benefits, but the benefit that you're not getting with just raw TypeScript is effects. And it's like if you've gone as far as TypeScript, the language and types, like it seems to me like you might as well just take that extra little step to
Yeah, but
effects.
you're too far into it. You don't see what a hurdle it is. It's like types. You go, oh yeah, now it's telling me immediately what's going wrong, what I've done wrong. But taking that jump to effects is you've just been immersed in it too long, and it's too obvious to you.
But I think part of it is that TypeScript, effects is a separate thing from the TypeScript language.
Sure.
What if TypeScript actually had algebraic effects built into it, like Rock or Unison or some of these more modern languages?
We don't know.
Then would effects just be
Maybe.
like types? It's
Maybe.
like
Because
hey, you do types, you also do effects.
in the Python world, there's just a huge percentage of people who go, why are we putting type annotations on things? The language doesn't require it. Yeah, if the language required it, then there's a bunch more people who would take it more seriously.
And maybe that raises the bar for how many people would cross over from JavaScript to
learn
TypeScript.
but I mean, they'd still have to learn the ideas.
Yeah.
It wouldn't just be suddenly.
I guess my hope for the world is that the defaults that our programming languages give us are better defaults. And for me, effects are a better default. So TypeScript should have algebraic effects built into it.
Yeah.
It doesn't. And so effect is a great way to get there. It's just that I think what you're saying is that there's some subset of people who have experienced enough pain or seen enough need that then are willing to take that next level step.
And I'm saying that subset is small, even though the numbers are big, just because the TypeScript community is big. But it's like, I mean, most of the people we're going to run into in the world are going to go, what are you talking about? That's so weird.
But we do have some data from Jeremy, which Jeremy is, he's a top-notch developer.
Yeah,
he's visiting us in Crested Butte this week, one of our friends. And he wasn't aware of effect last night and joined us for our
No, I think he touched on it a bit before, but he delved into some more last night. Yeah.
So he started looking through the docs on effect last night, and he was like, this is the most approachable effect, not just the effect the library, but just general side effect, thing. He's like, this is way more approachable than Zio. Whereas
he said
Zio...
the Zio docs, or he said the effect docs, he goes, these people know their audience.
So
that's what he said.
I want to throw in a couple of things here. So where effect is coming from was for a certain while sort of like this TypeScript twin project of Zio. Michael Arnaldi and John Negose, they know each other for quite a while. And I think Mike has been on a path to exploring what an effect system in TypeScript could look like, and was then also aware of Zio and tried to see, can this be replicated in TypeScript? And so he did. And for the longest time, effects tried to follow the footsteps of the Zio projects very carefully in terms of the same APIs, etc. Whenever Zio introduced a new kind of API shape, some advancements, not too much time passes, and some brilliant people in the Effect ecosystem, whether it's Michael or Maxwell, have replicated the same benefits to Effect. However, at some point, we also realized, okay, the mindset of a typical Scala and Zio developer is different than the one of a TypeScript developer. And funnily enough, we had some affordances in TypeScript that made it more ergonomic certain kind of use cases in TypeScript than in a sophisticated language like Scala, where you had in some regards better type inference, etc. And like the I think it's called direct style in Zio.
Yeah.
That was like kind of the default way to write effect code and to begin with in an even more ergonomic way. And so we at some point we kind of felt a bit of this tension of like, we could, why are we bound to those idiomatic aspects of Scala where we are trying to target the TypeScript ecosystem? And we also at some point took a very deliberate step where we changed our approach, where in the beginning we wanted to be like the home for functional programmers in TypeScript. However, then we realized that is a even smaller target audience, and there's so many who have those production grade problems that do not intend to become like full blown like FP approved functional programmers, category theory approved functional programmers, but
Wait,
who
there's an
just want
approval
to.
process?
Oh man, we should go for that
I didn't know
certification.
that.
I did not pass the exam.
Oh, okay.
We're the four
but
monad laws right now. Come on.
exactly. Um, but we basically saw an analogy there with the success of the React project, where React is sort of, I guess, the biggest Trojan horse for functional programming in the history of programming, where most programmers that use React are de facto doing functional programming, but
they don't
very
know it.
few like deliberately claim like, yes, I'm a functional programmer. And so we
They
try
don't
to see
talk about things in terms of functors in React. We're like,
so we
that's a
try to
functor.
see what can we learn from this example and from this success story, and how can we apply that to Effect. And this is where we changed the approach quite significantly, where we no longer, sure, like we want it to be a good home for people who want to do functional programming in TypeScript. They'll find Effect anyway, but we want to not have like a barrier to entry in terms of understanding that you can use Effect. You should be able to use Effect just as easily as you can use React once you understand some of the problems that Effect is trying to help you with. But you shouldn't have to first go through like a deep learning process of understanding all the theory behind it. I think
Before
that's the
you
beauty of the
understand what
TypeScript
problems it
ecosystem.
solves.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think the majority of Effect programmers further down the road will have no clue what an Effect system is, but they'll love Effect. And at some point, they maybe like get a better understanding of some of the theory behind it, but that should not be in the way. So I think there's like different audiences. You all are very enlightened to like understand all of the nuances of
Not me.
the different of the subtle differences and trade-offs of the different systems. But I think we really took a sharp turn and tried to make it all about being pragmatic. And this is where I think the biggest lever that we'll develop over time is by building out our own ecosystem. And I think this is I think that's the major strategy that not just will Effect give you solid mechanisms to deal with error handling, etc. I think we're also rebuilding the widest parts of the NPM ecosystem and build it in a way that's truly composable and is performant, well maintained, etc. And this is where I think if you want to reach for an advanced concept like workers, like serialization, this is where you're gonna canonically land in the Effect ecosystem. And I think this will be one of the biggest levers.
Yeah.
And just happens that all of that is made possible through an effect system from the perspective of a average TypeScript developer who wants to use
Yeah,
it.
I think that's how it's got to be, because I mean, for the last, I think we're getting close to 4 years now. I've been just hanging on by my fingernails while Bill and James have been going, "Oh, this is cool," and I'm going, "I don't know what's happening here. I don't know what's going on," and now it's finally starting to come together. But I'm thinking, the only reason I stuck with it is because those two, and there's no way anybody else is going to go through that process. And so what we're trying to do with the book is make it really accessible in the way that you're talking about. It's like, why am I doing this? What benefit is this bringing me first? And then once you see that, you go, okay, then I'm willing to look at some of these things that are kind of weird the way that I'm normally doing it. But if you just throw the weird stuff first, which is what a lot of the docs do, they just go, well, of course you're interested in all this,
Of course you want
mathematical
an IO
theory.
monad.
Yeah, of course you want to do, you want to, and you'll know the difference between this and why this is better than cats or whatever. It's like, of course you'll know all that. And it's like, no, did not at all.
Yeah.
So
Johannes,
it's a hurdle.
what drove your interest in effect?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was in 2016. I was frustrated by another problem that led me to found Prisma, which was all about making databases nicer to work with for TypeScript developers, or mostly JavaScript developers. And we took a bet on TypeScript and saw that bringing TypeScript to databases, which, like in Zio, you have what is this wonderful like this wonderful type safe layer around databases. I'm blanking on the name.
Oh, Quill?
Quill, yes,
Quill,
exactly.
yeah.
So something like Quill, we didn't have something as nice for the TypeScript ecosystem that brings type safety and like a sound way to do that.
I love
And
Quill, by the way. I think it's the
yeah,
best database thing I've ever used. It
I
is,
agree.
yeah,
And so
love it.
we wanted to address that. And so this is what led me to found Prisma. And this is where I spent close to 5 years at Prisma as a CEO, like building the initial version of the technology, hiring a bunch of people, as a CEO, growing the company up to 50 people. But then I had the fortune to also take a sabbatical, take a step back, and really think about what do I want to do with my life for the next 5 to 10 years. And I really felt the urge to get back into the shoes of a programmer again.
Huh.
And so I just started working on a couple of side projects, and I realized, okay, a bunch of stuff has gotten better in the TypeScript ecosystem. However, some aspects are just as bad as they were 5 years ago, and there was a, like things like React, etc., brought much needed like discipline and good principles into kind of a pretty lawless aspect of programming before. But I feel like we didn't really have that more for general purpose programming for most stuff that you write in TypeScript. And so this is where I started going on an exploration tour of just looking for better ideas. And I've done a bit of Haskell in the past where I had like really this experience. Oh my gosh, programming can be so different, so much nicer. And that was really refreshing and inspiring to me. But now that I also saw how productive you can be with TypeScript, I felt like there has to be a best of both worlds.
Mm.
I was also dabbling in Rust for quite a bit, but the memory management tax was always quite steep. So I felt like, okay, I can probably go further with this now. But for a lot of the apps that I'm building on a daily basis, I probably don't want to pay that memory management tax. And the more I fell in love with some of the more advanced functional programming things, also seemed like Rust is not the perfect home for that either. And I just looked around, like what is the most mature evolution of functional programming right now, and this is how I learned about Zio back in 2020, and also through your podcast, etc. Really went deep on that. But I was contemplating for a while, well, should I go back to Scala? We've actually built like a first version of Prisma back then in Scala before there was Zio, but I still had like some trauma from dealing with the JVM, etc. And that there was like a little bit of hope in between with like this Oracle project that allows you to compile it, possibly even to WASM and embedded. But that's we lost a lot of time on that, so I didn't want to really have
Challenges
much
with
to do
GraalVM.
anymore with the JVM.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping, can I bring those amazing ideas that I fell in love with around Zio? Can I bring them somehow into the JavaScript ecosystem? And that is how I found back then the project that was called Matech's Effect, and then later just became Effect. And so I started reaching out to Michael at that point. Also explored FPTS a little bit, but FPTS felt like the parts about Haskell that felt too academic and theoretical, and Effect felt much more pragmatic already in those early versions back then. And so I started interacting with Michael, and he was very helpful, and was very receptive to my feedback, where he said like, "Oh, this is like a bit unapproachable, etc." And he mentored me along the way and like helped me to get things up and running. And step by step, I really fell in love with that ecosystem and the potential in it. It was very early back then, and I probably had to deal with breaking like a new breaking change version every second day or so, where I felt like I was
Things
not
are moving
moving at
fast.
all in terms of my actual project. I was just catching up with all those changes, but every time a new change has landed, it made everything so much simpler, and I could like just delete tons of lines of code, etc. So the trajectory where this is leading me to was super promising, and I was on board. And here we
Yeah,
are,
you
almost
have an
4 years
advantage
later.
though. I feel I've experienced this advantage with Python because I've been involved with it almost since the beginning. And it's like, oh, here's a new feature, and you have all the rest of the features in your head, and you can just make that. You go, oh yeah, this is different. I see why this has changed. But somebody coming into it like cold, when it's gotten to that point, that's they don't have that benefit of seeing the incremental changes.
Been along the journey. So it sounds like for you, you had experienced through Zio and Haskell the the delight of composability and managing side effects, and like you'd kind of seen this like well architected picture and experienced it, and you're like, how do I bring that into a world that will allow me to build web applications, will allow me to leverage some great tooling? Am I summarizing that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, it got clear to me that even though I like taking on ambitious ideas, my goal that I set for myself is like going back into the shoes of like an app developer as opposed to like a tool builder. And so I was hoping that someone else would take over that part for me. And so I was just vetting those different projects and was trying to figure out like, is this just yet another library where someone is like really excited and drops it after 2 months? Or what are their incentives? What are their goals? And this is where I found the right partnership with Mike and Effect, where I saw Mike's like long term minded approach here. And that is yeah, we're now like 4 years into that project. Mike's been on it for even longer, and it's incredible how far the project has come, and in a way how we're just getting started. This year we had our first Effect conference, where we also had the honor to have John DeGoes there.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a big milestone that John even agreed to give a talk, but the kind of talk he would end up giving at the conference really like blew us away. He like had a couple of really interesting slides, and one of the slides was sort of like um, um, like a series of fish, one very small fish, which I think was sort of like the Haskell functional programming, which got eaten by a much bigger fish, which is Zio, eating the Haskell the Haskell functional programming approach. And then he drew a third fish, which was way larger than the Zio one, which is the effect one. And this is where he says basically the biggest impact that Zio has had was to inspire the effect program, the effect project. And that was very humbling and very
I think for
yeah.
John, he's very hopeful about getting many more programmers to do functional programming, and Scala can only get you so far. Well, I'd like to start with Haskell. Haskell can only get you a little ways. Scala can get you to, let's say, 1 million developers doing functional programming, but TypeScript has the opportunity to get you to 10 million programmers doing functional programming.
So was the reason that you created, you said this was the first conference you had, is that what inspired you to create the Effectful company so that the conference was under the umbrella?
So Mike, as the CEO of the company and also as the core author of the project, you'd have to ask him that question. I can
Okay.
only try to uh, replay what I still have in mind from his perspective. I think
Essentially,
he's
the
been
company helps promote and grow the community around Effect,
yeah.
and
And
There
you're
was
part of the company.
Exactly. So there was a bit of an evolution. And initially, Mike, so in 2020, 2021, Mike was still pretty focused on his fintech startup back then. He was still living in London back then. And Effect was only a means to an end to serve as a foundation for that fintech startup. And this is where also he was still not as interested in bringing Effect to the masses and making as approachable and pragmatic as possible, since he was already FP pilled, and so there was no point in changing that. But as the ecosystem, as the community started growing more and more, and as he just liked spending more time on the Effect project, I think at some point things flipped for him, where his primary objective back then, which was the fintech startup, took the second place, and the Effect project itself took the pole position there. And then I think he started entertaining the idea: could there be a company around this? We've been chatting about that for a while, and given my experience also with Prisma and having raised VC funding, and that was a very fortunate time back then to raise VC funding. And I think now the expectations are a lot higher, etc. So I urged him
well,
to
now
be
you just
very
have to have
thoughtful.
something AI in your name to get funded, I think.
Yeah, we've actually not played that card yet, but I like try to work with him closely on figuring out what is the right path, what is the right timing to go from a project and take it possibly the next step to create a company around it. And I was actually very not concerned, but like certainly it was top of mind for me that taking that step actually does not put the project at risk. Since I've seen many projects that were like on a good trajectory and tried to make it even better, bring on VC funding, etc., and then trying to like put a certain goal on the project that the project was never really meant for, and then the project no longer evolves in a positive direction because of that. So it was very thoughtful. I tried to be thoughtful about that, and in collaboration with Michael, we evolved a bit of a plan, and then we figured out the right time to actually take that step after we felt like we have a good commercial strategy around it as well that does not put the project itself at risk and does not monetize the project itself, but enables something even bigger around it, which is I think a good topic for a future a future episode. I think it's the short of it is that it's all about the question of like, now that you've built production grade systems, how do you run them, and how do you? Those are typically distributed systems, and there is no easy ways how you deploy distributed TypeScript systems. It's like most things that you deploy in that where there's off the shelf solutions for TypeScript projects, is sort of like a request response based model. But beyond that, where things are like queues are involved or durable workflows, you're kind of left. This kind of left as an
Yeah, I mean,
exercise
that
to the developer.
state becomes the primary challenge,
Exactly.
and I think one of the reasons we wanted to chat with you is because state in distributed systems is hard, and one of the hard things about it is, where does it live? What's the source of truth? Like do we just have a single server? Like, that's the easy mode. But then what if I want my data to be on my machine, like locally, and that be kind of the source of truth, and then I can decide to synchronize that data to a server if I want, and I have much more control around that data. So this is what it's called, like the local first movement, and I think this is one of your interests in, related to your journey in programming, is like, how do users get more control around their data? Is that tell me your
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a nice segue to like a very orthogonal aspect to what really captivated my mind back then. And so I was looking for a better way to build programs, and this is where Zio, etc., and ultimately where I went with Effect has helped me to build those programs in a better way. But then an orthogonal part to it is, how does data management work? And I think the most common approach is that you have like a client server style architecture, and you don't really trust your client much. All of your source of truth is living in the server, and that's how I guess like 99% of apps are built these days, and that's just the default path. That's also the easiest to build with things like Ruby on Rails and Next.js, etc. But there's actually many problems due to that kind of architecture. And when
scale
my
being one?
Sure, scale being one, but even if you don't scale, I actually think that scale is was too much of sort of that north star
Mm.
that drove too much of like the design trade-offs. And then you like reaching scale is still super hard, but now keep building apps that never really reach that scale have implicitly followed some trade-offs that don't make other paths very very possible. And
Well,
so
you always hear
there
it whenever this comes up. People are always like, "Oh, and GitHub runs on like one MySQL database, so one database will scale just fine." Like whatever it is. Like, people are always like, "You can scale forever on a single database," and yeah. So I agree with you. It's maybe not always the right framing
But
around.
I'm curious about the details of this local first thing. What, because I'm imagining, I didn't even know that HTML5 or whatever it is now had a built-in two forms of built-in database, the SQL and the key data store. So I just found that out. But I'm imagining, okay, so all of your data is stored on your machine via that, but then there's some kind of replication that happens, or there's
Yeah.
something, and then how is that keeping my data private if it's still
So
living on a
before
server?
Happy to dive into the details
Yeah.
there in a moment.
Okay.
For those in the audience who have never heard about local first before, a few shout outs there. So I think there's kind of the canonical resource for local first. It's by the folks at Ink and Switch, and they've written an essay about local first, I think in 2018, and that lays out some of the problems and the ideals for what is local first. And so local first is not like a concrete technology in the way that GraphQL is a concrete technology, or gRPC is a concrete technology. Local first is more of an architectural idea how software could be built, and that gives you certain benefits, or in the way that they framed as like ideals. One of the ideals is that you should minimize spinners. We have too many
Mm.
spinners and loading states in the software that we deal with on a daily basis. And so briefly going through those ideals, I think that that's interesting to go through. Besides no spinners, you also have your work is not trapped on one device. In the web, we have now more and more collaborative software, but that you that the software is truly collaborative, like in Google Docs or Figma, etc. That's still tricky. And to actually accomplish that, you need to flip the architecture as well. But that's another kind of like table stage
Like
feature
real-time
of
collaboration
real-time
yeah.
collaboration, but also collaboration in a way that then also works when you're offline. So the third ideal is that the network is optional. And this is another really like
I
high
heard that
bar
you're
to
not on an effing plane. That's what I was told. I don't know if you got the reference to an old blog post that, yeah.
Yeah, but I like, for example, 2 days ago, I was spending 4 hours in a train, and by now, like working from a train quite frequently, I know exactly which sort of software is train ready and which one is not. Since
Train ready. I am offline all the time, like not by choice, by the fact that the cell phone network in Crested Butte happens to not work when a lot of people are here,
That's
or whatever,
summertime.
like, or driving from here to
but
Denver.
Oh,
You know,
right.
like
the tricky part about the train is not like on a plane where you don't have no connectivity at all, assuming you're not like on one of those fancy airplane Wi-Fi's. It's like on like if you're completely offline, most software that has put some intentional effort around offline functionality basically
but
just detects,
degraded
okay,
modes
you're
are
offline, it everything is degraded, but at least there's still some intentional ways how things work. What the worst is if you have poor connectivity when the app or system thinks, oh, like I'm online and I'm trying to do like all the things that rely on being online, but you actually have like very crappy connectivity. This is where software gets really, really bad. And this is the default in when you're on a train. And
yeah.
so this
Spotify,
is
by
yeah.
the way, is the worst at this. It's like when I'm driving from here to Gunnison, 30 minutes away, there's some spotty service, and Spotify just has no clue how to handle that. And then I can't listen to music, and it's frustrating. So
Exactly.
Spotify needs to go local first.
Exactly, which is funnily enough, kind of my main project that I'm working on, where I'm bringing effect and local first, all of that under one roof, where I'm trying to build a new kind of music app where you'd still bring your Spotify account to listen to the music that you have there, but trying to build a new, a new premium third party client for wherever your music is. So
That's local first.
hopefully,
And as you're on the
in a
train going through poor service, good service, degraded
Tunnels.
service, like all those things, it shouldn't care.
exactly. But like so far, we when we talked about no spinners, your work shouldn't be trapped on a device. So real time collaboration, network being optional. Those are like goals for the software. Those are like not concrete implementation details that might imply a
One
couple of implementations.
One
Briefly
addition
going.
on
Yeah.
on top of real-time collaboration, I also want to just add like real-time like status or like real-time data connectivity. Like it's not like collaboration I think is one piece, but I think to add to the no spinners, no reload buttons. I hate web pages that have a reload button on them. It's like, no, you know that the data changed. Give it to me instead of making me have to hit a stupid button.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is. I think if you've nailed the other parts, then this should be relatively. This should be one of the easier ones to solve. This is then only like the reactivity, more client side. However, just I think this is also directly an implication of that very server centric model,
Yeah,
where it's
exactly.
so tricky to kind of orchestrate all of like the moving data across the distributed system, that it's an easier trade-off for a product manager to say like, okay, no, we're not going to spend 2 years like rebuilding everything. We're just going to implement that button and it's like reloads everything from the
Yeah.
server again. Because flipping the art, like you need to flip the architecture. You can't gradually like add a little bit more caching, another maybe WebSocket thing that
It's
pushes
not
some data
incremental.
everything's gonna be like very out of date and very like out of sync on your front end if you haven't built this in this way for to begin with. Briefly going through the next four ideals, like another is like another aspect of that collaboration is like not just there's two forms of collaboration. One is across your devices, which is not your work not trapped on one device. So if I'm collaborating with myself on my phone and on a laptop, that's one form of collaboration. Then collaboration with colleagues. Then the fifth ideal is what they call the long now. That is basically about that most software that we use today is like kind of SaaS software that works as long as you pay your subscription and as the software vendor is in business. And we all know like the top 10 Google products that we used at some point that are no longer with us, and we can no longer use them, even though a lot of those could just, if they were built local first, Google Reader could be like brilliantly built local first, and we could still use it today. But they've built it in a server-centric, cloud-centric way.
And the
Where
servers have
so
to keep running
exactly,
for
as
you to be able
opposed
to use it.
to like DOS software from like how many decades ago, you can, if the computer is still in a functional state, you can boot it, and the software from like many decades ago is still gonna run, might just as well in the last stage where you left it. But that doesn't work for SaaS software from 5 years ago, mostly.
Mm.
So that is what's about the idea of like the long now, that we
Mm.
create so much amazing software and it's all probably going to be inaccessible and gone in 5 years from now, which is kind of
Just because
terrifying
of the
to think
server
about.
orientation.
Is this
Exactly.
just like would you say that we're that pendulum that swung from what long ago was local first but not really distributed, uh, swung to client server? Maybe it even started as client server and then went to local first. Swung back to client server, is now beginning to swing back to local first and away from
Yeah.
like client server
I think
architectures.
back then it was like local only, and
Yeah, yeah,
where
that's a
the
good way to put
advent
it.
of
Because we didn't have
the
a network.
Yeah.
exactly, like where the network slowly came in, and maybe then, like I think you had sort of interesting in between with Dropbox, where you had like some files that could be
Uh,
synced, and then at some point, where you just like where you could just slap the cloud on everything, and that made everything better until we also understood the consequences of it, which now local first is trying to deal with. So I don't think it's like the pendulum swinging back to the previous position. It tries to like see what are the benefits of that previous position, what are the benefits of the cloud, and what are now the best of both worlds.
mm.
Hmm.
And I think this is really well articulated in the ideas of local first. And the last two ones, like that you have security and privacy by default, which you don't really have with most cloud software, and that you own and control your data, which you also don't have with
So
cloud
I want to
software.
know about those two things, in particular, the own and control your data, because we were talking about it's still. So I'm imagining, okay, the data's on my machine, and if it gets replicated on the server, it gets encrypted in a way that only my machine can decrypt it, or is there something like that going on? How's that work?
Yeah, so this is maybe the now that we went through them, we can flip a little bit more into like as engineers, we'd like to understand how does it work, how is it implemented, and that's how we can maybe trust it and
Yep.
actually believe it. And so a common way how local first software is implemented is, for example, through CRDTs. So that like let me see whether I can put together the acronym fully. I think is like
Conflict
uh,
free replicated
Re-
data type.
exactly. You got it.
The F is
um,
lost.
Yeah, it just wouldn't sound good if it was CFRDT. Too many letters.
so the idea of that is like that this gives you. I mean, the easiest way is to play around with it and form your own intuition. But the idea is basically that this gives you some data types that if you model your state with that and then you use that, then that automatically can get synchronized around devices, and that is like a very interesting way to model state. And
This is all
with
about
that,
distributed state and coming up with I would say algebras that define the laws for how that data can move across systems. But that's maybe too mathy of a way to describe it.
That's the kind of thing I think where you would want an algebra. I don't want to necessarily understand it, but it's like you want to know that yes, we have determined that this works.
Yeah. Some constraint.
Exactly. So, and I think the core idea there is that you locally, as you build your app, maybe you build a note taking app or whatever, you just, instead of just assigning a JavaScript variable and then later thinking about, oh, now I need to post it to a REST endpoint, you just instead of assigning it to your own normal JavaScript variable, you just use a CRDT to use that state. And that CRDT is typically has like a network adapter, etc. And then it works across instances. Those things take often take also things like authorization, etc., into account. There's a few notable technologies such as auto merge, which is Rust based, so works even across language ecosystems. There's YJS, which I think is another very common JavaScript CRDT implementation. So CRDTs is, I think, the most common approach to build local first software that gives you most of those properties out of the box. There's still stuff you need to take care of, but that is, I think, sort of like Pareto principle style. Just doing that gets you almost all the way. And
One
then
quick
there's also,
one quick
yeah.
plug on CRDTs. So we did an episode a couple of years ago with Mark McGranahan, who I'd worked with at Heroku, and he has some app that is a local first app. And I don't think he used that terminology at the time. Maybe the terminology didn't exist. But we dove pretty deep with Mark on CRDTs and the different CRDTs that exist and why they're useful. And so that's a useful one. And then we also did an episode with Jonas Bonaire on what Lightbend had done with their, what was Akka serverless, and now is called Calyx or something, which is their like CRDT framework. So we do have a couple episodes from the past about CRDTs.
Okay.
But I think it's fascinating to frame local first is like, okay, you want to go with local first for all these reasons. Architecturally, there are some challenges. You know, it's harder than REST. Like REST is conceptually a pretty straightforward. REST with a single database, man, I can understand that.
That's call and reply.
Yeah, exactly. But when you go to local first, you probably are going to need a different approach for how you deal with data, and CRDTs are the best way to do that we have discovered so far. Is
Yeah,
that
I
accurate?
think it's a very solid way to build a large amount of the local first apps. I personally explore a different data paradigm as a foundation for that, which is mostly about event sourcing. If you squint, there's a lot of similarities between event sourcing and CRDTs with different trade-offs. But so this is something that I'm very interested in for the reason that I have still a bit of a trauma of like dealing with database schema migrations in the past. And
Doesn't everyone?
Yeah.
and given that CRDTs don't necessarily address that out of the box, I was interested in a foundation that allows me to decouple my read model and my write model a little bit more, which is why I'm exploring like what event sourcing and like syncing the event log across devices, how that can enable local first software. So that's what I'm using to build Overtone, this music app that I'm building, and I'm even thinking of open sourcing that
So
as well.
you didn't necessarily have to reach for CRDTs in that case because event sourcing was sufficient. And
yeah, and for what it's worth, I think you can get away with like very naive approaches to build software that fulfills all of the local first ideals. I've seen some people who basically just have a JSON blob, and they just write send across the wire always the entire full JSON blob. They do like very naive last riders wins. And so this is, you can also get away with
I
that.
would say
You
that there
might
is an algebra to that. I don't know if I would categorize that as being necessarily a CRDT, but you essentially have defined an algebra that says these are the rules that my data conflict resolution is going to be resolved with, and that's what the CRDTs are ultimately providing as well, is conflict resolution. Like, how do I know is the true state of the system? And so,
exactly. But I think one of the core ideas were like a traditional web developer who's coming from that client server architecture dogma, like they need to rewire their brains in a couple of ways. And I think the biggest one is to let go of like all of the server centric responsibilities. Kind of like really, like I forced myself to do that by not allowing myself to have a server in the first place where everything needs to happen on the client. There's a lot of hoops you need to jump, particularly for the web, where when it comes to like cross origin, like CRS things, etc.
of
But
course.
once you've rewired your brain to trust the client, like allow the client to do all the app needs to do. And in the case of a note taking app, or in the case of a mail client, or in the case of a music client, this is like by definition, all of that stuff should happen on the client. This is why it's called a mail client. um, and
Not a dumb
and
client,
yeah,
not a dumb mail client, but a actual mail client.
exactly. And so it turns out that web technologies, etc., those are actually incredibly capable if you leverage the potential that they give you. And yeah,
But
I
there's
think
some
that's
challenges, like you generally, when you build a performant UI, you don't want to block the UI thread. And so yeah, you can use web workers, but if you don't have a framework that helps you do concurrency, then it's going to be hard. And so is there a connection here with effect? With the ability, like, can you just take effect, and does that make your life building local first easier?
so. This is where I need to introduce my second hat, not just my app developer hat, but also my library tool builder hat. I've briefly mentioned that the way how I'm exploring what a local first data stack could look like is following the ideas of event sourcing, and this is where I'm building my own new data layer called LiveStore, and that tries to wrestle with all of the things that you've just mentioned, like kind of keeping the UI thread mostly under
Unblocked.
control, and like not blocking it, but still giving you the affordances, such as like a sane way to deal with concurrent data edits, syncing, persistence, etc. And
How
so to
how
build,
important in this is the primitive of distinguishing side effects? Like,
yeah,
is that
so
critical,
to
or is that like nice to have?
to build this library live story,
Yeah.
I am using a ton of effect for that. And like probably the it's probably one of the libraries and one of the tools built with effect that uses the widest surface area of the effect capabilities, just because by definition it deals with so many distributed systems problems. So it works across workers, so it needs to work with a main thread, it needs to work with different kind of worker threads, given that you can have multiple tabs that a web app can run in. And there's also some syncing that needs to happen there. I actually need to do some sort of leader election, so like my data persistence when I'm writing to something like OPFS or IndexedDB does not conflict there as well. So you
Do
need
you
to
do a
deal
CRD?
with.
Do you use a CRDT for leader election across tabs?
For that, I'm using Weblogs, which by
Okay.
now I think are pretty reliable. But just to deal with all of that, there's lots of stuff that can go wrong, which is where I'm using Effect a lot for. But also everything is so dynamic and fluent. Like you can have a tab that the user could decide to kill. Then the other tab needs to take over as the leader, that tab might need to do some cleanup work, free up some resources, etc. So all of like the life cycle management stuff is like absolutely key to get right. You also have a lot of messaging between tabs, between workers, where you want your state to kind of propagate in the right way. You need to enforce certain rules. Effect, for example, has a module called STM, which I think also there is one in Zio as well, which is very handy in a lot of those cases. And one of the coolest things further down the road that I'm going to use heavily is a new effect module called effect cluster or effect workflows, which tries to bring the ideas of like actor system or durable workflows into effect in the first like as a first class citizen, where you also going to have persistence for those workflows. So this is maybe something to talk about in a year from now.
Yes,
with like talking about it in terms of like me using it, since it's already out there in an alpha version in case someone wants to check it out. But yeah, this is
I
how
guess
all the things come
what's kind
together.
of fascinating around this is that you've got a client server application, your client's the browser. You're like, sweet, I don't have a distributed system. But then somebody opens that site in a second tab. Now you have a distributed system. And that's exactly what your point is. Okay, now how do I deal with state across just 2 different tabs? Like that
Right.
alone is a
But
challenging
you
problem.
you already had that distributed system before when you want to like one of the core ideas that I want to facilitate with LiveStore is to give you on your UI thread, I want to enable you to do synchronous queries. So when you access a variable, most of the time you want to get the contents of that variable in a synchronous way. And only in a particular cases you do it in an async way. So the idea of LiveStore is to give you a always up to date in memory SQLite version that's reactive, that powers all of the state and all of the data. However, on the main thread, I don't often have the permission to actually do the persistence from there. So, and I also don't want to use too much work of the main thread to do that there. So I have a worker where I do the persistence. So even in a single tab case, I already have a distributed systems problem where the main thread needs to stay up to date with the web worker to do the persistence and the reactive in memory, as well as like if you sync between devices, then you also have a distributed system. So I think this is another interesting perspective on the web world where like most JavaScript, TypeScript developers are on a daily basis dealing with distributed systems problems, but they've never heard the term before, which is kind of funny.
Yeah. Well, then I can see how having the foundations of functional programming and effects do make these problems in a way easier to reason about and come up with solutions for. And so, yeah, it seems like there's a lot of connection between local first and local first. I think is in some ways an admission that we live in the world of distributed systems, whether or not we want to, and functional programming effects are a great tool to help us deal with the complexities of distributed systems.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're very orthogonal, but one is a beautiful way to deal with the other.
Yeah. And CRDTs, of course, is being an event sourcing, being some other strategies there. But yeah, I think um, there's been this industry just ignoring the complexities of the things that we're building. And in some ways, we've kind of been waiting for the languages and frameworks to kind of catch up to create better abstractions so that we can actually ignore some of those complexities. And it sounds like
Exactly.
that's what you're doing with the what's it, Live Sync? What was the name of the
LiveStore? Yeah.
Live Store? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
There's
like,
like
let's create that
one.
abstraction that does the right things under the covers so that yeah, the developers don't have to think about all the complexities of data synchronization and distributed systems. Yeah, that's cool.
Exactly. It's not going to be the one fits all silver bullet. With distributed systems in particular, it depends and more trade offs than with anything else. So LiveStore is maybe useful if someone wants to use SQLite for how they think about state, and if they want to go with event sourcing in terms of like how data flows. If that's your jam, then LiveStore might be interesting.
Yeah.
But I think there's many other viable options. CRDTs, I think, is a very good one to get started and see whether that's good enough for your use cases. And I'm sure there will be many other approaches.
It's great. I like that we're kind of getting to the point where we can admit that the days of CRUD need to be gone, because our needs have evolved considerably beyond what CRUD can deliver.
Well, it's always a level. I mean, we're always trying to move up levels of abstraction so we don't have to think about the nitty gritty stuff.
Yeah. And
Because it
that's
holds us
actually
back.
the beautiful thing about local first. It even though whenever there's something new, you kind of think about, oh, there's like additional stuff you need to do. But what's so cool about local first, there's actually, once you've learned it, there's way less stuff you need to deal with. Like you
Mm-hmm.
can, in the ideal case, you only build your client, you have some very principled data stack that you're using in the same way when you're using React, and you don't need to think about how is the DOM like reconciled and how are events flowing. You just use that. And now you do that for data. You don't need to build that server. Syncing just works. There's way less that you need to architect and build. So it simplifies and collapses complexity like nothing I've seen before.
Oh, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. You, before we started recording, you made some assertion about TypeScript and how it was gonna, I don't know, dominate the landscape and everything. And I didn't, where I held back my question, which was, are you taking WebAssembly into account there? Because it seems like that brings a whole bunch of newer things in that aren't maybe shackled by JavaScript
Yeah,
as much.
that
I mean,
that's
I don't want to
certainly
use
like,
TypeScript because I don't want to have anything to do with JavaScript. I feel like it's a poison that if I touch it, I will die. And so thank you, WebAssembly, for making it so I don't have to use TypeScript
yeah,
or
it's
JavaScript.
certainly like a very bright glimmer of hope that I'm very excited about. I am actually using a bunch of WebAssembly both for Overtone, the music app that I'm building, as well as for LiveStore. So I'm running SQLite in WASM. I'll probably push more of the LiveStore implementation that's currently in TypeScript for the performance critical parts into Rust and therefore into WASM. I think also with like WASM components and more capabilities, and possibly even maybe through WASM we get better multi-threading in the browser than what we have with TypeScript or JavaScript right now. So I'm very excited by the possibilities there. I'm not as sure yet with. I think this is probably mostly a foundation and a playing field for tool builders or only the very most sophisticated app builders. But I think the majority of applications is still gonna be written in TypeScript. And so I think the majority of app developers, I think, will sort of play in
There's a
the
gravity
TypeScript playing
to that
field.
world for sure.
And then, I mean, another wild card is like how fast AI is maturing and progressing. So it's already the world has already entirely changed if you think about the job market in 2018 compared to today. Back then, you could it feels like with like 2 months of boot camp, you could command a really high salary. And right now, you have some pretty capable engineers having a much harder time looking for a job. And so I think there's a sort of a correction in terms of the market of like how big an engineering team should be. Engineering orgs get more efficient. Maybe it drives out some of the less experienced people, and maybe that also means the kind of chosen tools and languages change. I think it's very dynamic, but my default bet would still be that TypeScript dominates the like majority of app development.
Well, at least in the near term, yeah.
Yeah, it'll be. I'm thankful that effect exists, because if my future is TypeScript,
at least you have
at
that.
least I have that. So
You'll be amazed how ergonomic many parts of TypeScript are. I mean, you'll be proven correctly in terms of how unprincipled many JavaScript things are, but TypeScript effects, if you use effect for most of the things, you
it keeps
won't
some
really have
guardrails
to
on that
stare as much
appealing.
into the abyss.
Yeah, exactly. It does keep you away from the nasty bits.
Mm.
Shield from the poison. That should be your
Mm-hmm.
tagline for effect. Shield from the poison. Well, Johannes, anything else? That was fascinating.
If anyone is interested in learning more about Local First, I'm also running a Local First podcast called Local First FM. So
Awesome.
if you're curious to hear more about that, I
Well, right, and
shamelessly
you
plug that
mentioned a
one.
paper, and then there's, maybe we could have links to that paper and then your podcast.
Yeah, I'll put
in
those
the,
in
Sure,
in the
yeah.
notes. Yeah.
And obviously, since we talked so much about effect, if
Well,
you're
obviously, yeah.
dealing with TypeScript and you're not yet using effect, or you haven't yet checked it out, please give it a try. We're putting together more and more examples. I think the documentation, which there wasn't any a year ago, and that was the most common point of feedback. I think by now we have a really extensive, great documentation. We have an amazing community. We have a super nicely growing ecosystem. We have a very active Discord community. So if you're just getting started and you're still trying to put together your mental model, feel free to ask any questions in the Discord. You'll be amazed how quickly you get some really high quality answers.
So is it a nice community? Have you
It is a
managed?
fabulous community, and we try our
Okay,
best to keep it that
because
way.
functional programming doesn't always have the
I
best
know.
reputation
My
for nice
was
communities.
another not a major point, but was another point of like why we didn't try to orient it too much about like all functional programming.
Mm-hmm.
And but I mean, the TypeScript ecosystem also has its fair share of like drama, etc. So we just try to not be too tied to one thing or another. We just try
Mm-hmm.
to like treat each other very kindly, try to be helpful, try to be respectful,
Nice.
and it's very nice where we are right now.
The Discord community I've found for Effect is an incredible place. It's kind people, very helpful. It's a very warm community. So yeah, if you're interested in being part of that kind of community, then
Nice.
then the Discord is a fun place to hang out.
Excellent.
Cool. I've learned a lot in that place, probably more than other places, even beyond TypeScript and Effect. So yeah.
Okay. Oh, and I should probably also plug that my Easy Racer thing that I've talked about a number of times, there is now an Effect version of it, an Effect TypeScript version of the Easy Racer client. So if people want to compare different structured concurrency things across Effect and many other languages and frameworks, that's a fun one.
Right. Okay.
Very cool.
All right. Well, thank you, Johannes. Really appreciate all your insights and for sharing that with us.
This was amazing. Thank you so much for this great conversation.
Okay.